On your Monday episode of Locked On Raptors, the Toronto Raptors don't dunk enough, and there's one guy in the draft who just might be the fix.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? And welcome to another episode of Locked On Raptors, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, April the 28th, and I am your host, Sean Woodley. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors now for 11 seasons on various platforms. You can find all my work over on Blue Sky. You can also find the show on Instagram, and you can join us in the Locked On Raptors Discord server. Link in the description of the podcast. Come hang out. Please, you can also support the daily Locked On Raptors newsletter, QR code on the screen. If you want to subscribe, if you're watching on YouTube, or if you want to go to the link in the description of the podcast as you listen on audio, you can do that as well. Just drop your email in the bar. You will get fresh, piping hot emails from me 5 days a week talking about your Toronto Raptors. It's a wonderful thing, and it's 100% free, so go subscribe. There's no reason not to. Today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. Turn any TV into your Xbox. No console needed. Head to amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to learn more. And on today's show, we're going to learn more about VJ Edgecombe, one of the top prospects in this upcoming draft, projected anywhere between 3 and 5, I think, on most mock draft boards that you see around the internet. We're going to get into VJ Edgecombe, his whole deal as a player, what makes him a fun, interesting, dunk-tastic prospect. We'll get into how he'd fit and address the needs of the Toronto Raptors and their roster build, and then we'll get into what it means for sort of the long-term picture. How would a guy like VJ Edgecombe alter the future of your Toronto Raptors? Let's start off with the tail of the tape on VJ Edgecombe. He's a 6'4", 6'5", freshman guard out of Baylor. Actually interested to see what his final measurements come in at the NBA Combine later this month or next month. We're almost in May. It's later. It's around the time of the lottery. All the prospects will gather and they'll, get their stuff measured, and we'll see where VJ Edgecombe comes out. There, he might be closer to 6'3". Who knows? I don't really care that much because the whole thing with him is he jumps real high and is super athletic, and the 6'3", 6'4", 6'5" distinction kind of doesn't matter so much to me as it would for maybe a different guard with a little bit less in terms of athletic tools at his disposal. He averaged 15 points a game, 5.6 boards, 3.2 assists, 2.1 steals. Yeah, gets lots of steals, 0.6 blocks as well as a guard. Not so bad. A better than 2% block rate, which is very good for a guard in particular. 55.2% true shooting on the year, 34% from 3, 50% from 2. So not like the most efficient player in the world playing for Baylor this year, but he really kind of picked things up as the season went along. He really started off poorly in out-of-conference play, especially as a three-point shooter, and then he kind of got red hot in conference play, finished the season strong, ends up at 34% overall, 36-ish% on about 125 catch-and-shoot threes per synergy as well. And so, yeah, that's kind of the full statistical look at VJ Edgecombe. You may remember as well, he was very, very good for the Bahamas last year at the last chance tournaments ahead of the Olympics. Couldn't quite get that team with Buddy Hield and DeAndre Ayton into the Olympics, but he was kind of the guy who sort of stirred the drink for that Bahamas team last year as one of the lead ball handlers. He's very, very interesting. Well, we'll get into the on-ball creation stuff. FIBA is very different. You can't take what happens in FIBA and apply it to the NBA. Otherwise, Dennis Schroeder would be a perennial MVP candidate. But lots of really intriguing stuff for VJ Edgecombe. And I believe he was 17 years old or just turned 18 playing for that Bahamas team in international play. Very cool stuff. And I mentioned it already. He's an insane athlete, probably the best athlete in the class, just based on kind of what you read from those in the know who watch these things. He is the guy who comes to mind as the top athlete. You might hear a couple of the sort of overseas guys come up in this conversation as well, but it seems like VJ Edgecombe, pretty consensus, the most impressive athlete in this year's class. And with the athleticism brings all kinds of dunks, baby. This is the thing that VJ Edgecombe maybe does better than anybody else. He gets to the rim a lot. He gets to the rim at the same rate and frequency about as Dylan Harper and Jeremiah Fears did as rookies or as freshmen this past season. Didn't finish wonderfully. He was only 50% or on his twos and about 54% at the rim. Not great, but man, oh man, the dude can dunk. And I think there's a very real outcome where VJ Edgecombe becomes one of the single best in-game dunkers in all of basketball because of his combination of he gets a lot of steals, so he gets it on the break a ton. That leads to plenty of dunk opportunities. He also seems to just really like dunking on guys. You may have seen the clip. I've referred to it before when we've talked about Edgecombe on the podcast, but you may have seen the clip where he dunked on Mark Few, the coach of Gonzaga's son, in their game against Gonzaga at the very start of the season. One of the nastier in-game dunks we've seen all year at any level of basketball. He's really impressive. And as someone myself who loves dunks, I find myself very partial to VJ Edgecombe as a prospect as a result. I mentioned the shooting, 36.3% on catch and shoots. Not so bad. Again, got way better as the season went along. And on top of the shooting being at least functional and seemingly like it's going to be a thing he can count on to at least be like an average weapon, I think you also look at the two-way ability of VJ Edgecombe when you're kind of trying to get the view of him from 10,000 feet as a player. We'll talk about the driving. We'll talk about the attacking a tilted defense, the three-point shooting, how that all can kind of fit within the Toronto Raptors quite nicely. But the other stuff that he brings to the table is very much a lot of the defensive end. I talked about the steals, 2.1 steals a game, 0.6 blocks, makes events happen all over the damn place. He's got a really great knack for kind of rotating himself into steals, if that makes sense, where he kind of knows even before the guy who's throwing the pass knows where the pass is going. Like VJ Edge comes on it, he'll hawk passes, kind of rotating over to the wing, just kind of snatch it at midair, turn it back the other way. And because he's so fast and just sort of bouncy, he turns a lot of those steals into highlight reel plays. He's a great transition player. I think he'd be a really fun piece playing alongside Scotty Barnes and kind of help maybe the Raptors get back to their transition glory. They were not a good transition team last year. They were awful, 27th in points per play on the run after it being kind of a feature of their offense for years before. First year for Darko, they were a really heavy transition team and scored a ton in transition. In fact, they led the league in transition frequency during Darko's first year, and they were incredible at converting those chances. You move on from Pascal Siakam, that's going to hurt things, of course. If you add some transition talent and finishing in VJ Edgecombe to the mix, not only will he help them just kind of score more on the run, he'll make them way more of a highlight factory in the open court as well, which again, really very much kind of fits my sensibilities when it comes to watching basketball. As far as the stuff to look at, when it comes to swing skills that dictate his upside, I think the big thing when you read about him, when you watch the tape, when you watch the breakdowns from those in the know, again, lots of great folks doing this stuff. No Ceilings, Hoop Intellect over on YouTube is a wonderful one. All of the folks who do really great work are just geniuses. They help me kind of inform and shape my opinions on these guys for sure. When it comes to the handle, like that's going to be the thing. If it can sort of tighten up, if he can figure out how to use his handle to get to his spots in the half court more effectively, that's where that sort of star upside gets unlocked. I think there's a very high floor when you look at VJ Edgecombe, just because I think the two-way with the three-point shooting and the attacking of closeouts, like that's just going to make him a useful NBA player. I think there's a very real chance that his most likely outcome is a guy who can be on the floor in playoff games to close for good teams. Like, does that mean he's a star level guy? Maybe not, but can he be someone who you just trust to have on the floor when things really matter, when not having any weak spots to poke at is an important thing, as the playoffs have shown us? Like, if you have weak spots, if you have areas that are potentially vulnerable, the entire exercise of the playoffs is one of poking at those holes until they become gigantic season-ending chasms. And I don't think VJ Edgecombe is going to be someone who has those holes to poke. And again, there's room for him to improve upon his self-creation stuff to really turn himself into a really, really interesting, maybe not lead primary creator, but secondary ball handler who can run some stuff for you, maybe work pick and roll, all types of stuff. That's there for him if he can work on the handle, which right now is kind of loose and kind of lets him down a little bit. The handle almost hasn't caught up to the power of his first step, if that makes sense, where I think athletically he's got the ability to turn the corner on anybody in individual coverage, but that handle doesn't quite help him get there as smoothly as he'd like. But, for me, it's a mix of he's clearly got a lot of feel for the game. He's a good passer, 3.2 assists as not the primary creator for his team. We know he's got the dunking ability, the high fly, highlight reel stuff. The 3-point shooting is seemingly solid at the very least. It's just, high floor. And when you mix in the athleticism and the feel for the game. Like, those are two things I'm willing to bet on when it comes to thinking about higher end outcomes for his development as well. So that's the read on VJ Edgecombe. He's probably going to be off the board third or fourth. This means the Raptors would have to move up in the draft in order to get him in all likelihood. And, we'll get into why it might not make sense for the Raptors to target Edgecombe should they move up to 3 or 4. You're not taking him if you end up number 2. That's just going to be Dylan Harper, as we talked about last week. Obviously, number 1 is Cooper Flagg, but there's like an 8.5% chance they move up to 3rd, and there's also an 8.5% chance they move up to 4th as well. So 17% chance they'll be in the mix for a guy like VJ Edgecombe. It's interesting. We'll get into some of the fit stuff and why he might not be the sort of go-to pick for me if the Raptors do end up at 3, for example, and have their pick of the rest of the class after the top 2 guys. But I certainly wouldn't be upset about it either. We'll get into all that coming up in just one sec. Today's show is brought to you by friends over at PrizePicks, the single best place to play daily fantasy sports. And the playoffs are here for basketball and hockey. Maybe your season-long leagues are over. Maybe you lost those leagues horribly, as I did in the Locked On Raptors Fantasy League. But that's okay, because you can turn your attention to daily fantasy with PrizePicks. It's a wonderful way to get your fix during the postseason. PrizePicks makes it simple. All you got to do is get more or pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and you're in. You can even mix and match players across sports. You got basketball, hockey playoffs. You got baseball ongoing as well. And for a shot, to do that, of course, you can get up to a shot to win up to 2,000 times your money. That is pretty sweet. Obviously, as you have more players in your lineup, it increases the chances that you're going to earn a lot of money if you win all of those picks and you guess correctly on more or less for various stats projections. Nikola Jokic, more than 25 points, feels like a pretty safe bet, as he is everything for the Denver Nuggets as this insane series against the LA Clippers carries on and heads back to Denver for Game 5. Maybe you're in on Austin Matthews getting more than a goal in a given game as they try to close out the Ottawa Senators in their first round series. Leafs Buds. Go Leafs, go, baby. Either way, download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's LOCKEDONNBA to get 50% instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks. Run your game. Back at it here on your Tuesday episode of Locked On Raptors, talking VJ Edgecombe, one of the top prospects in this upcoming draft. A Baylor Bear, was never teammates with Jacoby Walter, but essentially took over the Jacoby Walter gig in the Baylor rotation in his first year this season after Walter was selected after his freshman year to the Toronto Raptors last summer, as we know. Let's get to the fit of how VJ Edgecombe would work on the floor with the other core players on the Raptors and how he addresses the needs for this team. Look, I don't think like dunking is necessarily like a team-wide need in the sense that you might say like a youthful big man is, or some two-way juice, more defensive chops, more shooting even. But like, I don't know, dunking is helpful, especially for a team in the Raptors that sucked scoring at the rim this year. They shot the 29th ranked percentage at the rim per clean glass this season, despite getting to the rim the second most often of any team. Left a lot of points on the table at the rim. And while VJ Edgecombe isn't a great finisher so far, was not as a freshman overall, the dunks certainly help upgrade that percentage a little bit. And look, I've talked about it before, having Jonathan Mobo as your leading dunk guy as a second-round rookie who spent part of the season in the G League, maybe not the best if you're someone who wants to see a lot of dunks, which I am. It's like half the reason I watch basketball. And so, yeah, he would address that need specifically when it comes to dunking, a need that I think is probably more important than it actually is when it comes to playing good basketball in practice. But there are other needs he would address as well. I think the defensive playmaking between him and Scotty Barnes would be pretty awesome to watch. And I'm a big believer that as much as I think a lot of what the Raptors did defensively this year, where they improved as the season went along, they were 7th after January 1st. They had stretches, months where they were number 1 for, a sample of 15, 16 games. I think they need to make reinforcements to the roster to sustain the defensive jump they made this season. I think there's still a little too much in terms of one-way guys and situations where like you're just not going to be fully comfortable with everyone you have on the floor defensively. I think they need to find two-way guys. Masai Ujiri said it as well. They need to be finding two-way guys. He said this at his post-game presser a couple of weeks ago. Certainly VJ Edgecombe would address that need. And again, I think the defensive playmaking to throw him and Scotty Barnes out there together to muck stuff up, to blow up possessions, to get on the run after steals. That's pretty fascinating to me. I like the fit with Scotty Barnes, especially if the three-point shooting is good. We know three-point shooting and Scotty Barnes go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're awesome. And I think VJ, yeah, when you add in that athletic sort of component to it, the sort of thing that they don't have a ton of outside of Scotty Barnes, who himself is a very good athlete, but there's a lot of like craft and feel guys on the team, guys who are still kind of figuring out what their athleticism means in the context of the NBA. I'm thinking of like Grady Dick, for example, where I think he's athletic, but is he strong enough to sort of get the most out of that? Who knows? I think VJ Edgecombe is going to just kind of fit on an NBA floor right away because of the athletic gifts he has. And so I like the defensive combination for sure. I think you sketch out a long-term starting five of Manuel Quickley, VJ Edgecombe, Brandon Ingram, Scotty Barnes, Jakob Poeltl. I think that's pretty exciting, right? You have that more sort of defensive-minded, less in need of the ball in his hands type of guy in Edgecombe who can spot up away from the ball. If ever he's able to tap into the on-ball creation stuff, that fit with Quickley gets super interesting because it allows Quickley to be more off the ball. But I still think with Ingram, with Barnes, with Quickley, you're going to have a lot of creation going on there. It wouldn't put this crazy burden on VJ Edgecombe to go and become this excellent guy who can create from nothing. And I think within the Darko Rajakovic system, where it's all about creating one advantage to press it somewhere else on the floor as you move the ball, as you move people, I think VJ Edgecombe could be the kind of guy who really excels in that kind of environment on offense. I think imagining him in sort of like a more defense tilted version of Norman Powell's role on the Raptors, before obviously he got moved and became this more sort of, electric scorer with the Clippers. I think if you think back to the best of Norman Powell, like in playoff series, when he would be this kind of secret agent that could drop into a series after struggling and all of a sudden, wow, like Norman Powell has opened things up. The reason he opened things up is he was an excellent, excellent driver against tilted defense, right? Against a defense that's compromised, having to recover from cleaning up one mess over here, sending two to the ball. You swing it around the horn. It ends up in Norman Powell's hands in the corner. And with the defense not prepared, he was so good at just driving and yamming on dudes' heads. It was awesome. Finishing at the rim. I think that could be a very similar role that VJ Edgecombe occupies, especially early in his career when maybe the creation stuff is still being sorted out. Over time, maybe he levels up and becomes more of a guy who can move quickly off the ball in that backcourt. But I think the way that he could help kind of finish possessions for this team as someone who could drive and then make the next play. He's a nice connective passer. I think he has a good head on his shoulders, good sort of feel for the game, as I talked about earlier. I think he'd be a wonderful fit in the Darko scheme and would just bring that sort of extra punch and electricity that they don't quite have from anyone. In theory, Jacoby Walter can be this type of guy. Though Walter, I think, is a little more craft-based, head fakes, change of speeds, that type of stuff. Edgecombe is more, I am hammer, basket is nail, I'm going to dunk on it. And I think that element will be really nice on this team as well. I think, they're just like a lot of things that he would do to fit nicely. I think he'd instantly become the best prospect they have in-house for sure. And I think, just like a really fun addition to the team, like a guy who throws it down, who plays two ways, like very easy fan favorite fodder, I think, for a guy like that. And, I find it really interesting because Edgecombe, to me, I talked about the floor I think he brings to the table, where I just think he's going to be on the floor for teams in important games in his career. It just kind of feels like the type of guy he is. I think maybe the upside is a little less likely to hit than it is for maybe a guy like, I don't know, let's say Jeremiah Fears, who has this like crazy high upside if things really hit. Even Ace Bailey, just because of the size, and Kaman Malawach, who I've talked about before, who I think like defensive upside for him is a real thing that maybe gets slept on a little bit because we like offensive upside and big point totals. I don't know if I quite see Edgecombe reaching like all-star status necessarily. If he does, obviously amazing. And I'm not ruling it out because he's 18 years old or 19 years old. And obviously things can happen over time that change and new information and all that stuff. But I think he's a fascinating guy to think about when it comes to the Raptors, because another need we've talked about with the Raptors is just the need for an upside swing. They stand to gain so much if they just get a star in this draft, right? Just with the way they're built, they're kind of ready to go if they can get a star in-house. And I think if they're third or fourth, they're going to be compelled, I think, by the idea of taking Edgecombe because of the athleticism and that combination with the feel, as we talked about. Like, that is a thing to bank on if you're trying to envision higher end outcomes down the line. Obviously, you got to know like what kind of worker the guy is and all that stuff. That stuff they kind of do in the pre-draft process and figure that out as they go. It's a little more unknowable from our end because we've only seen him play in college for 1 year. But I think, yeah, it's like it's an interesting one for the Raptors, I think, because I think you could talk yourself into some other guys at that spot being higher upside plays. But there's also a world where those guys aren't quite in the mix to be on the floor in important games and, kind of fulfilling the need for 5 good two-way players on the floor. Come on, Malawatch. We're seeing Rudy Gobert, for example. There's some series where that type of player has a hard time. It's not all series, it's just some matchups, and mostly it's Luka Doncic in particular that gives Rudy Gobert a lot of trouble defensively. But I think there are a lot of matchups where, that kind of big, size-driven rim protection guy can maybe get into some trouble. I think Malawatch has some mobility to him that I think is going to make him a little more playoff proof, but it's a thing to note and be concerned about. Ace Bailey, I mean, the bust potential there is pretty huge considering the crazy shot selection and the fact that he has a hard time getting to the rim and all of that stuff as well. VJ feels like there's like very little bust potential here, but will he really be that boom pick that the Raptors could sorely use? It's a really tough one. And also you have to kind of bake in the way the roster is built, right? And maybe this is where we'll pick things up on the other side. Because I do think VJ Edgecombe, while he would bring a lot of really interesting things that I'd be very happy to watch play for the Toronto Raptors, it does really complicate things when it comes to the depth chart and the roster balance and just the complete logjam of guys at the 2-guard spot. We'll get to that to close things out and take a look at how VJ Edgecombe would affect the future building of this Toronto Raptors team. We'll do that in just one sec. Today's show is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action right now. When you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. It's that simple. So throw some money down on any team, right? A heavy favorite. You think the Indiana Pacers are probably going to sweep the Milwaukee Bucks? Take the Pacers to win Game 4, and if you win, you'll get $250 in bonus bets for your trouble. It's great. There's all kinds of bets you can make. You can bet on player props, three-pointers, steals, assists, all the way to who's going to win the title at the end of the day as well. It's all there for you to go and peruse, and they're very easy to use app, and you can combine live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big as well if you want to have some fun. Of course, I'm a big fan of the happiness hedge. Watching hockey these days, I think the Maple Leafs are probably going to beat the Senators in Game 5, but I'm going to bet against the Leafs to win just so if they do lose and I'm sad and stressed out and concerned, as the series goes back to Ottawa for Game 6, at least get some money out of the deal. That's what you should go do as well if you're into making sure you're kind of moderating your emotions during a trying playoff time. Don't miss out. Head to FanDuel.com. Claim your $250 in bonus bets today. That's FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Wrapping things up here on your Monday edition of Locked On Raptors, talking VJ Edgecombe, who's very cool. And I would be not at all upset if the Toronto Raptors took him were they to move up to 3 or 4 in the draft. I suppose there's a small outside chance he falls to 7 or 8 if the Raptors are there. I doubt it, but you never know. The draft is weird. Guys fall for strange reasons all the time. But I would expect he's off the board by 5 at the latest, just based on how things are shaking out. And again, I just think there's like a pretty high floor you can expect from VJ Edgecombe. Like, I think at the very worst, he's in that sort of, flirts with all defense tier of guards, offers enough on offense. You're sort of Drew Holiday, Jalen Suggs, formerly Marcus Smart, Alex Caruso type guys. Maybe they struggle a little on offense. Maybe he struggles on offense and it hurts you a little bit. And he's just not this like huge point getter, but those kinds of guys who can be on the floor, be functional on offense, and defend the hell out of the ball. All pretty exciting stuff, and guys that I think you're happy to get if you pick 5th in the draft. 3rd or 4th if you're the Raptors and you need an upside swing. Again, I think that's where it could be more open to interpretation, and maybe you got like Ace Bailey or Kavan Malawatch or even Jeremiah Fears becomes a guy you covet more. When it comes to how it would affect the sort of building of the future of this team if they were to take Edgecombe, the Raptors, like, it all comes back to RJ Barrett, right? And I think more broadly, it comes to the continuous sort of we have a million shooting guards problem on this team. And it's not a problem. Like, it's not like a really horrible thing to be like, oh God, my arms are overflowing with all these competent shooting guards. Like, it's a nice thing to have. A surplus at a position can be a real tool for you as you try to build your team out. But if you take Edgecombe, you've got, of course, behind him or in front of him, RJ Barrett, Jacoby Walter, Grady Dick, Ochai Agbaji. And you'd think something would have to give on that positional logjam if they were to take Edgecombe. And maybe it doesn't happen this summer. Maybe they wait and see what they've got. But I do think by the deadline, you're probably looking at a draft that ends up with Edgecombe in Toronto, probably leading to an RJ Barrett trade by the deadline. Maybe a different trade where Ochai Agbaji's offloaded. Maybe it's both. Like, there's all kinds of ways it could go. But obviously the luxury tax thing is the thing to consider. They will be, if they jump up into the 3 or 4 range, the luxury tax thing will be a thing because it's more money to pay for that rookie and it'll nudge them over just by having their team. And it might necessitate a decision. Again, doesn't have to be the start of the year, can be by the end of the season to deduct the tax. Again, my number one hope is that they just pay the tax and go forward. Again, I'm not even totally concerned about the RJ thing. I think the RJ thing, there's a possibility he gets moved no matter who they draft. But Edgecombe just kind of exacerbates the logjam at the 2 guard spot for this team. And when you have Brandon Ingram now, there's just not that many spots at the 2 and 3 for all these guys to get minutes, right? Unless like Jacoby Walter comes out and starts flashing like point guard stuff and can be your sort of, Raptors version of Malik Monk is for the Kings, and he can run point with the second unit type of thing. Like, you're running out of space to play all these guys and also maintain functional size on the floor. And so I think it's a fascinating thing to think about. Would they just kind of go for the upside play here, say, screw it with the positional logjam? But like, I don't know if that's like, I know like, yeah, best player available. You got to take the best player available. I know this is what every draft person will say is take the best player available. Again, wildly subjective, totally in the eye of the beholder. What you think is the best player or who you think is the best player at a certain spot is probably different than what I would think or that, front office person X would think. It's all just a kind of a made up gobbledygook draft term that doesn't mean anything. But when you're thinking about it and say you're at 3 on the board and you have Edgecombe and Ace Bailey and Kaman Malawach there and Jeremiah Fears and whomever else you might think is deserving of being in that range of the draft, I do think like fit on the roster and roster needs do have to come into the conversation, right? And I think, in all this sort of talk of best player available and don't draft for fit, like I think drafting for fit actually matters because if you draft a guy who doesn't fit, then his odds of developing into the thing you hope he can become just get slashed like that. It's all about situation. It's all about opportunity. It's all about playing time and pathways to playing time. And if you take Edgecombe, not only does it probably necessitate an RJ Barrett trade, but like the Raptors seem pretty high on Jacoby Walter and Grady Dick. But I think Jacoby Walter in particular, I mean, the way Darko talked about him at the end of the season, I think they have like big things in mind for Walter after what was a pretty impressive, last 80% of his rookie season after a tough start. And so do you take Edgecombe when there's other guys there in an Ace Bailey or Kaman Malawach who address a need for size and shooting or both? In the case of Bailey, I think, being a 6'10 guy who can let it rip, like that's a pretty sweet deal. Kaman Malawach is your long-term succession plan to Jakob Poeltl, which they kind of need one of those at some point soon here. Like those guys, maybe you think they're pretty much on the level when it comes to upside compared to VJ Edgecombe. Maybe you even think Edgecombe has like a smidge more upside, but are you more likely to get more out of Bailey or Malawach and their potential if they're playing on your team when you don't have a log jam at their position? It's an interesting conundrum. I think because of the way the roster's set up and because they do seem to really like Jacoby Walter quite a bit, my guess is that Edgecombe wouldn't be their pick if they were at 3 or 4 and he was on the board and one of these other guys was there. I think they'd probably skew towards more size. I think they'd probably, try to angle for, again, I think Malawach is a very, very, very good prospect. I know he's kind of, polarizing among some. I just don't see a world in which he's not an excellent defender in the NBA, who's at the very least just throwing down lobs for you all the live long day. And so with that, I wonder, as much as I'd be thrilled with the pick to have a guy like Edgecombe throwing down cool yams for the next 7 to 9 years for the Raptors, I think they probably go another route if they're at 3rd or 4th. And I could be totally wrong because we're wrong about stuff in the draft all the time. But just thinking about the longer term sort of fit of the roster, the build of the roster. I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with Quickly, Barrett, Ingram, Scotty, Poeltl, Edgecombe, Shed, Walter, Dick, Ochai, Battle, Jonathan Mobo. Like that's a lot of interesting players. That's a fun rotation to run out with. next season. Obviously, maybe you move RJ and that changes. Maybe you find some roster balance that way. Probably necessitates that if you're moving RJ after drafting VJ, that you're finding some roster balance and a backup big or something like that with that kind of move. You can achieve it. I just, I think it's just in the interest of size. This team needs size. They don't really need more 6'5" guys. And I do think they probably end up skewing towards the larger dudes who might be available if they do jump up to 3 or 4 in the draft. We'll see. Obviously, I could be proven wrong because, again, we're all dumb at picking the draft and predicting what's going to happen. And we only know, so much about the internal workings of how these front offices make these decisions. But I think to sort of summarize, VJ Edgecombe, very cool player, probably not like the highest upside of these guys, because I just think the self-creation stuff is probably going to be quite a work in progress, but it could totally work out. I think I'd bet against him being the guy the Raptors pick if they have the pick of a bunch of dudes. If he just falls to 7 or 8 and he's there and your Malawatches and your Baileys are off the board, then yeah, I think you just take him because, wow, this guy who was supposed to be a top 5 pick fell a little bit lower. This is incredible. We just take it and we run and we laugh and we watch all the dunks for the rest of time. But I think all things being equal, I think they're probably going to go in a different route just because they're so stocked at that one position. And I don't know if the upside of Edgecombe is so great or so much greater than the guys in that same sort of range of the draft that it would compel the Raptors to take him and sort of further complicate their pathways to minutes for a lot of their most important prospects right now. Walter and Dick are probably the 2 most important prospects on the team. If you want to consider Dick a prospect now 2 years in, I still think he kind of qualifies. But it's an interesting thing. Either way, they take Edgecombe, there's nothing wrong with it because he'll do really fun, cool things for a long time for the Raptors, and that would be pretty sweet. Either way, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for rocking with the show. Please follow, subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend. We'll be back again tomorrow with our pal, Vivek Jacob. We might do a stupid little game again because we love playing stupid little games with our pal, Big V. And it's the off season. It's the time where stupid little games reign supreme. Of course, we'll have more draft coverage. I'll probably talk about Ace Bailey later this week as well. As I'm trying to hit on these guys who are likely to go in the high lottery while there's still a chance the Raptors might pick in the high lottery. I don't want to have gone through this entire draft, season without covering these guys, but if they end up picking 7th, 8th, or 9th, then I'll probably be a little bit less compelled to do these deep dives on these prospects. So we're talking about them now. We'll do Ace Bailey. We'll probably do Kaman Malawatch, even though he might be closer to where the Raptors end up picking anyway. A couple other guys as well. But either way, thank you so much for rocking with the show, and we'll be back again on Tuesday. Another episode of Locked On Raptors. Follow the newsletter, QR code on the screen. Of course, 100% free to do that. Join the Discord, link in the description of the podcast, etc., etc. Thanks so much for hanging. Bye-bye. Damn.